All right, so our next section of notes is titled Sectionalism North versus South. And sectionalism is the idea that you are loyal to a specific region geographically. So this lecture is going to look into why the North was so loyal to Northern culture and beliefs, as well as why the South is loyal to Southern culture and beliefs. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is what were the economic and social differences between North and South. And the first thing is that the North is more industrial than the South. So in the North, there was a main focus on railroad construction, on mining, and on factory work compared to the South, because the South was way more focused on crop growing and the cotton harvesting, cotton exportation, and plantation agriculture. So we'll see that the North is going to be more urban, while the South was more agrarian. So in the North, you're going to see large cities forming, while the South is going to remain mostly farmland and very spread out among the population. So we'll see that 1 in 4 Northerners are going to live in a town compared to 1 in 10 Southerners who are going to live in a town. And another thing that's going to add to the increasing of towns, especially in the North, is immigration. So we'll see that we have a lot of German and Irish immigrants that are coming over and going into the North. And a main reason why immigrants are going to want to stay in the North and stay out of the South is because in staying in the North, you don't have to worry about competing with the plantation agriculture in the South. And so we know that in the South, the main way to make money and be the wealthiest you can be is to get involved in crop production and in the slave and plantation agriculture. And so immigrants decided that it would be a better idea and a better way for them to be more prosperous if they stayed in the North and they didn't get involved in the slave agriculture. So we can also begin to look at, was the South exploited by the North? Because Southerners are definitely going to feel this way. And this is because the South depended on the North to finance crop growing, to finance their cotton, their tobacco, their sugar, their rice. So on top of financing, the South is also going to depend on the North to market these crops and also to transport these crops for export. So because the North is dealing a lot with the money that is involved with actually marketing and getting the crops where they need to be, much of the profits are going to end up in Northern pockets. And so the South is going to feel that this is unfair because they're putting all of the work and all of the effort into growing and harvesting the crops when the North is still going to benefit from this, even though it's such a Southern process and all of the work is coming from the South. Going forward as, well, what is the South going to do about this? How is the South going to attempt to diversify their culture and diversify their economic abilities in measuring up and staying equal with the North as they continue to industrialize? Because the main thing that we'll see is that the South feared that they would become a colony of the North, just in that the North would be this elitist group that would only need the support of the South. They didn't really need the South as far as sustaining the United States as a whole. And so the South wanted to make sure that they were right alongside the North, just as equal as the North, as far as industrializing and staying ahead of the game. So we'll see, as a result, what the South is going to do is they're going to quadruple railroad mileage by 1850. So we see the South decides that they're going to take the step in industrializing, and we'll even see that the South is going to increase manufacturing and mining. However, cotton production is still going to remain the #1 priority of the South. That's their main way of making money. It's the main way of sustaining the economy. So even though they do agree that, okay, we'll try this industrialization, they still have to put their main efforts into that cotton production. And so as a result, the North is still going to remain ahead industrially. And this is also just because the North's only focus is industrializing, where the South, they're having to focus on 2 things. And they're having to make industrialization the second thing on their list of priorities, where the North, their only priority has and will continue to be industrialization. We can also begin to look at who is controlling politics, because we know again that the majority of whites in the South, they don't own slaves. But we'll see that the Southern elites that are controlling politics and social lives is going to be the planters. And the planters are making up less than 5% of the white population. So even though they're this extremely small number, they're still holding the South's best farmland, and they're also holding on to most of the wealth in the South. And again, this is because the planters, they're relying on these crops to make their money. So they're going to secure the best farmland in producing the best crops, in harvesting the best crops, and making the best cotton that they can make in order to export it out to places like Britain and receive that money. And when they receive that money, they're going to hold on to it and they're going to continue the cycle of, well, let's make more, produce more to get even more money. We'll also see that the northern elites are going to have similar power. And in the north, we have lawyers, merchants, and businessmen who are going to control a lot of the politics in the north. And we'll see that rich Americans in the north and in the south, they're going to find it easier to get into politics just because they're more educated, they have more time, and they have more money to explore these avenues and to get into politics. Because if you're rich, you have more free time on your hands just because you already have the money, so you don't have to be bending over backwards and working to secure money because you've already got money. And the money, of course, will help them explore, help them get into different areas that they wouldn't have if they were poor. They just have additional resources. We can also begin to look into northern and southern values and how they're different. And we'll see that a lot of Southerners didn't want to industrialize and they didn't want to urbanize. They were very comfortable in their way of living, and they weren't quite ready for the adjustment of farm life and that transition into city life and to living and communicating with a bunch of people in one concentrated area. And so we'll see that there's this very romanticized Southern culture in that Southerners believe that they were very gracious, very hospitable. They believe that they were very humble people who didn't need a lot to satisfy them because family was going to be the most important thing. They see that in the North, with industrialization and with this big shift from what was once farming culture, they see that as more materialism and this Yankee materialism. And we'll see that with these divides that begin to emerge in Northern and Southern values, the Southerners are going to refer to the Northerners as Yankees, and they're going to continue to disassociate because they feel that they want to focus on the family, while the Northerners or these Yankees are going to focus on material things and just trying to figure out, well, what's going to be the next best thing. That industrialization, now that we've got the railroad, now that we've got our factories, they're going to want to continue moving forward instead of focusing on the family. And that's what's going to be important in the South. So we'll see, looking at the North, Northerners are going to be better educated, and as a result, they're going to be more responsive to new ideas or to these egalitarian ideas. And this is really important when it comes to abolition. So when we talk about egalitarian, this idea that everybody is equal, this is going to make the North a lot more responsive to talks of abolition. And it's going to make Northerners a lot more open to discussing equality between whites and between blacks. And maybe there shouldn't be such a thing as slavery. Maybe we need to eradicate this because, again, these things, they're not, slavery is not adding up with these ideas of enlightenment. An important thing that we need to discuss when it comes to education, however, is that the North is better educated because of their population density. The South had a low population density just because, again, everything was a lot more spread out in the South. And so in the North, when you have these large towns and you have a more concentrated population, it's easier to establish a school where all children have access to that school. Versus in the South, where you have a spread out population, you might try to set up a school in one area, however, not the entire population of school children are going to have access to that. And so it's a lot harder to build schools because you're trying to make sure that all the school children get there, but when they're spread out, that becomes a more difficult project. And another important thing is that the South is also going to feel that they don't need as much formal schooling just because they're working on farms. And so they could be educated by their parents. The parents could teach them simple things that they could use in everyday life or values and beliefs that their family and their culture held on to. However, they're not going to see the same need for formal schooling and really advance things to be a farmer and work on their plantations and overseeing their crop growing. So again, just looking into some differences in Northern and Southern values. The Southerners are going to condemn any radical ideas. So again, any ideas that are associated with abolition. Again, they're very comfortable in what's already working for them, what they've already established as their culture, as their economic principles and in their ways of sustaining themselves. And so any challenge to that, they're immediately going to ignore, or they're immediately going to combat with, well, this is what is already working for us. Whereas the North, they're definitely more open-minded in discussing that challenge. Another interesting thing is that the South is going to be more violent than the North. And you could make an argument that this is because the white plantation owners had to punish their slaves. So they're more likely to carry weapons, they're more likely to use weapons, and it starts with their slaves. Because again, if the slaves aren't working fast enough, then they can be whipped, they can be beaten, and so Southerners are going to have those weapons ready to go just to punish their slaves. But when we do talk about these distinctions, we also have to acknowledge that there are going to be many Norths and many Souths, just in that a lot of these principles and a lot of these cultures are going to be dependent on economic bases or distinct geographic locations. So this is a very generalization in saying that most of the Southerners had radical ideas against abolition, and most of the Southerners were more likely to carry and use weapons. However, it's not saying that all Southerners would participate in these principles. And the same thing is going to be true about Northerners. So looking into how is slavery profitable for the South, we know that cotton prices are going to remain high after the invention of the cotton gin. And so when you have cotton prices remaining high, you're also going to have slave prices remaining high as well. And so we'll see that the South is going to continue to invest in slavery and invest in this plantation agriculture just as much as the North is going to invest in industrialization. So again, each one has their own thing that's going to be their priority. For the North, it's industrializing, and for the South, it is cotton production. Another important thing is that cotton is going to grow much more efficiently in the South compared to anywhere else in the world. And so this is important because the South is going to have no threat in dominance as being the #1 provider of cotton. So they don't have to worry about making money because they're #1. And as long as they keep producing as much as they're producing, they're going to stay #1 because climate is on their side, the cotton gin is on their side, and they have that massive labor with their slaves. Another important thing about slaves is that slave labor is going to be adaptable. So much of this is going to be urban. However, we do see evidence of slaves being used industrially. And one example would be slave labor in coal mining in Richmond, Virginia. So again, planters are going to be able to use their slaves to their advantage. And any way they can use slaves to make money, they're going to go that route. So one thing we can also look at is, would slavery still have existed without cotton? We know that by 1860, there was still a worldwide demand for cotton. Cotton was going to be the #1 material to make clothes, and so again, everyone's going to want it. We'll see another important thing is that slavery is going to be a form of social control, and this is especially important in the South just because it's going to ensure white supremacy. And so it's this idea that whites own blacks, that the blacks are the property of whites. And so it's setting up this idea that because blacks are property, they're inferior. Because if blacks are working for the whites, they are the inferior group here. And this is why even to the poorest and even non-slave owning whites, they're going to want to preserve slavery as well, just because it keeps them off the bottom of the totem pole. And so as long as somebody is below you, then you're doing okay. So the poor whites needed slavery to keep on going because if slaves were going to be equal with whites, then they feared, well, am I going to become inferior? Can I get lumped into that social group who is not going to have the same opportunities? So they wanted to make sure that they were not at the bottom of the barrel. And another thing, white Southerners in general, they feared that an abolition of slavery would result in an economic collapse, just because, again, they're relying on cotton production and cotton exportation to give them money to their economy and even into their own pockets. They're also going to fear that there's going to be this social disintegration, and that if you abolish slavery, you start to abolish the ideas that blacks are inferior to white. And so again, it's saying that you're losing the idea of white supremacy. And if you're going to benefit from white supremacy in the South, the whites are, again, going to want to use that to their advantage. They don't want to be the person who's at the bottom. And so because you would have this social disintegration, this idea that, well, maybe equality is a possibility between whites and blacks, the whites feared that this would lead to a race war between whites and blacks, because blacks would see that, okay, this is an idea of equality, so I am equal, which would then create problems with whites because they definitely don't want to have that equality there. So this idea that race war would break out is going to be another Southern fear. And we'll stop there.